My name is Mira Callahan Weston. I am 34 years old. And on the evening of Saturday, the 14th of October, I was sitting at my parents' dining room table watching my sister Diane tap out a message on her phone beneath the edge of the tablecloth, the way teenagers do when they think no one can see them. The dinner plates had been cleared. The anniversary cake was half eaten. My father had just gone to the kitchen for more coffee, and my mother was laughing at something my brother-in-law Kenneth had said. The room smelled of vanilla and old wood and my mother's good perfume. It was their 40th wedding anniversary. My phone buzzed in my lap. I looked down. The message came from a group thread called Family Dinner, a thread that had been created 3 Christmases earlier for coordinating holiday plans. Diane had apparently forgotten, or perhaps never noticed, that I was still in it. The message read, "The loser is gone, come over after. I have champagne." I read it once. Then again. Then I looked up at the back of Diane's head, her dark hair pinned at the nape of her neck, her shoulders relaxed because she believed she was safe. I typed 2 sentences. I hit send. Her phone lit up on the table. I watched her read it. I watched her body go very still. I watched her turn, slowly, the way someone turns when they already know what they are going to see, and our eyes met across 7 feet of my parents' anniversary table. I didn't smile. I didn't speak. I just looked at her. What she didn't know, what no one at that table knew, was that the moment she was celebrating my absence was the moment everything was about to change. What she didn't know was that the house we were sitting in had been redesigned, from the hallway to the dining room to the staircase, by me. What she didn't know was that in 4 months, a feature on my interior design studio would run across 8 pages in Architectural Digest. What she didn't know was that for 31 months, while she had been dismissing my career at every family gathering, I had been building something she could not take apart, because she didn't know it existed. This is that story. To understand what happened at that table, you have to understand the Callahan family. And to understand the Callahan family, you have to understand that there have always been 2 daughters and 1 story. Diane was the story. I was the footnote. She is 7 years older than me, which meant that by the time I was aware of the world around me, Diane's version of it had already been written in permanent ink. She was the first to graduate, the first to marry well, the first to buy a house, the first to produce a grandchild that my mother could display in Christmas cards. By the time I was 23 and figuring out what I wanted to do with my life, Diane had a 4-bedroom house in Charlotte, North Carolina, a husband named Kenneth who worked in commercial property development, a daughter named Olivia, and a position as a senior sales associate at a real estate firm that she described at every holiday gathering as though it were a cabinet appointment. Our parents, Gerald and Patricia Callahan, live in a Victorian house on Abercorn Street in Savannah, Georgia. Gerald spent 31 years teaching high school history and retired 3 years ago with a pension, a vegetable garden, and a deep satisfaction with his life that I have always quietly admired. My mother worked for decades as a medical billing administrator and keeps a house so clean it always looks staged. They are good people. They are not unkind. But they are also products of a generation that measures daughters by how well they have placed themselves, and in that accounting, Diane had placed herself extraordinarily well, and I had not placed myself at all, or so it appeared. My husband David and I live 20 minutes from my parents in a craftsman bungalow on Whitaker Street that we bought 4 years ago. David is an environmental engineer. He works long hours. He believes in me the way a foundation believes in a house. Quietly, structurally, without needing acknowledgement for it. When I tell you this story, you need to understand that without David, the chapters I am about to describe could not have been written. My career, before everything changed, was described by everyone in my family as decorating, not interior design, not creative consulting. Decorating. As in, an expensive hobby that happened to occasionally involve other people's living rooms. I had studied art history and design at the Savannah College of Art and Design. I had spent 3 years working under a senior designer named Margaret Toole, who was exacting and brilliant, and who taught me more about space and light and proportion than I could have learned in a decade on my own. By the time I left her studio, I could read a floor plan the way my father reads a history textbook, fluently, with full comprehension of everything that came before and everything that might come next. But in my family, none of that translated into anything Diane recognized as real. The first time I understood this clearly was at my own wedding, on the 17th of June, 8 years ago. David and I had been together for 3 years. He was kind and intelligent and deeply in love with me, and I was deeply in love with him. We held the ceremony at a small estate outside Savannah, a venue I had personally styled with dried botanicals and oyster shell votives and long linen tablecloths in pale gold. It looked extraordinary. 3 guests asked me that evening who my designer was. Diane found me at the bar at 9:30 in the evening. She had 3 glasses of wine in her by then. I could tell from the way her eyes had that particular softness that precedes the things she actually thinks. She put her arm around my shoulder and said, loudly enough for the 2 couples standing nearest to us to hear, "You know David is punching up, right? I just want you to be prepared. Men like him eventually want someone with real ambition. I've seen it 100 times." I smiled. I said, "Thank you for coming, Diane." I did not say the other things I could have said. I filed it. I remembered it. The second time happened 3.5 years ago in November. I had been developing a business plan for 16 months. I had a name, a client acquisition strategy, a detailed financial projection, and a meeting scheduled with a small business lender for the following Thursday. I needed a bridge loan of $15,000 to cover my first 6 months of operating costs while I built my client base. I asked my parents if they would consider lending it to me, with a written repayment plan, at whatever interest rate they felt comfortable with. My mother said she needed to think about it. 3 days later, she called me and said no. I did not find out until 14 months later, through a conversation David overheard at a family barbecue, that Diane had called our parents the evening I made the request. She told them, and these are the words David heard directly, "Don't do it. She'll spend it on fabric samples and call it a business expense. You'll never see that money again." $15,000. That was the cost of her confidence in me. I did not confront her. I did not con my mother and tell her what I had learned. I sat with that information in the passenger seat of David's car on the way home from that barbecue, and I looked out the window at the Savannah streets I had known my whole life, and I made a decision that was quieter and more deliberate than anything I had ever decided before. I would build it without them. I would build it without their money, without their belief, without their knowledge. And when it was built, when it was real and documented and impossible to reduce, I would let it speak. The third time was Christmas of the year before last. The whole family was gathered at my parents' house. Diane and Kenneth, their daughter Olivia, David and me, my parents, and my mother's sister, Aunt Rose, who visits every December from Jacksonville. We were halfway through dinner when my mother mentioned, with genuine warmth, that I had just finished redesigning the living room of a client on East Jones Street, a physician and her husband who had hired me after seeing a project I had done for their neighbor. Diane looked up from her plate. She said, "How much do you charge for that?" I told her my project rate. She put her fork down. She looked at Kenneth, then back at me. Then she said, "Is that per room? That seems high for what is basically decorating, no offense." My father said, "Diane," she said, "I'm just saying. There's interior design as a profession, and then there's what Mira does, and I think calling them the same thing does a disservice to actual interior designers." I took a sip of water. I said, "You might be right." I was not agreeing with her. I was ending the conversation. Those 3 moments, my wedding, the loan, and the Christmas dinner, were not isolated incidents. They were a pattern woven through 20 years of holidays and phone calls and family photographs. A pattern of Diane deciding, in advance of any evidence, that I was less than she was, and saying so, in front of whoever happened to be present, with the casual authority of someone who had never been wrong before and therefore could not imagine starting now. What Diane did not know, what no one in my family knew, was that by the time of that Christmas dinner, I'd been operating my own interior design studio for 17 months, and I had already passed $120,000 in annual revenue. I had 3 active clients, 2 pending contracts, and a portfolio that was quietly, steadily accumulating work that would eventually be impossible to dismiss. I had not told them. I had made a decision sometime in the middle of that second year to let the work speak for itself. Not because I was being strategic, but because I had learned, through long observation, that telling Diane my progress only gave her more material to dismantle. So I stopped. I built in silence. I kept my calendar on a cloud account that no one else could access. I kept my business name entirely separate from my personal social media. I paid myself through a separate bank account that David knew about and no one else did. I built it. In silence. For 31 months. By the night of my parents' 40th anniversary dinner, the night of the text, my revenue for the current year was $416,000. I had 2 full-time employees and 3 contracted freelancers. I had recently completed my most significant project, the complete redesign of my parents' house. The house we were sitting in, the house Diane had spent an hour complimenting without once asking who was responsible for it. That last part requires explanation. 6 months before the anniversary dinner, my father called me on a Tuesday morning at 7:45. I was at my drafting table, finishing a materials board for a project in Bluffton, and I almost did not answer because I had a client call in 15 minutes. I answered. He said, "Mira, your mother and I are planning something. It's our 40th anniversary in October and we want to do a proper dinner for the family, but the house needs work. Not repairs. Something more than that. The whole downstairs, the living room, the dining room, the hallway. We want it to feel like something. Like we meant it." I put my pencil down. He said, "We want you to do it. Your mother picked out some pictures from magazines. We have a budget." He told me the amount. It was $48,000. They had been saving it for 3 years without telling anyone. I said, "I'll do it for what it costs me, no design fee." He said, "Absolutely not. You'll charge us your rate." We compromised. I charged materials plus 20%, which was less than half my standard fee. It was the most meaningful project of my career, and I would have done it for nothing. There was one condition, which I set myself and communicated clearly to both my parents before I agreed. Diane was not to know. Not because I was planning a confrontation, but because I knew with the certainty of someone who has been studying a subject for 3 decades that the moment Diane found out, she would interfere, she would have opinions, she would suggest her own contacts, she would find a way to make it about herself or, failing that, to reduce it to something smaller than it was. And this project, my parents' home, 40 years of a life they had built together, was not something I was willing to let become a vehicle for her anxiety. My parents agreed. My father, especially, seemed to understand without requiring further explanation. He said, "We'll tell everyone a crew is doing some renovations." Which is true. That was the moment I stopped being the footnote and started becoming the story. Let me go back to the beginning of the build, because the ending only means something if you understand what it cost. I registered Hartwell Creative Interiors, Hartwell being my maternal grandmother's surname, as an LLC with the state of Georgia on the 3rd of March, 31 months before the anniversary dinner. I did it from the kitchen table at 7 in the morning while David made coffee. The filing fee was $95. I paid it from a savings account I had been quietly building for 2 years, setting aside a portion of every freelance payment I received, every cash gift, every tax refund. By the time I filed, I had $4,200 in that account. It felt like 400,000. My grandmother, the woman whose name was now on my business, had worked as a seamstress for 40 years and sent 3 children to college on income from a skill she had taught herself. I thought the name was right. I thought it was the right kind of inheritance. My first real client under the Hartwell name was a couple named the Ashfords, Denise and Marcus, who had just purchased a home in Savannah's historic district and needed a full interior renovation. Denise had found me through a mutual contact, a woman who had hired me on a small project the previous year and mentioned my name at a dinner party. The Ashfords wanted the whole main floor redesigned: kitchen, living room, formal dining room, and primary bedroom. The project ran from April through July of that first year. The total invoice was $68,000. It was, at that point, more money than I had ever invoiced in a single year, and I was doing it in 4 months. I worked every weekday from 7 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon, then again from 8 at night until 10:30, after David had fallen asleep. I kept a project notebook, spiral-bound, green cover, the same kind I had used in college, and I filled it with sketches and material samples and meeting notes and measurements. By the time the Ashford project was complete, I had filled 3 of them. Diane called me in June of that year. She was planning a family gathering for the 4th of July and wanted to know if David and I were coming. I said yes. She said, "Are you still doing your little projects?" I said yes. She said, "I keep meaning to ask, have you ever thought about getting a real estate license? You're already in the space, sort of. Kenneth could probably get you in front of some people." I said, "I appreciate that." We talked for 9 more minutes about the gathering logistics. She told me to bring potato salad. I said I would. I did not mention the Ashford project. I did not mention the 3 new inquiries sitting in my business inbox. I did not mention that I had the week before hired my first part-time contractor, a stylist named Vanessa Ohu, who was extraordinary and whom I was paying $42 an hour for sourcing and logistics support. I brought the potato salad. The second year accelerated far beyond what I had planned for. The Ashfords referred me to 2 other clients before their project was even finished. One of them was a developer named Paul Gerard, who was converting a historic building on Congress Street into 4 high-end residential units and needed all 4 interiors completed in under 5 months. That project alone generated $112,000 in revenue. It also generated my first press mention, a small paragraph in a Savannah lifestyle magazine crediting Hartwell Creative Interiors for the quietly distinguished interiors of the Congress Street conversion. I read that paragraph 6 times. Then I cut it out and placed it in the green notebook. Diane and I saw each other at Thanksgiving that year, at my parents' house. We were still in the original kitchen and living room. My redesign was months away from starting, and the house had the particular sadness of a space that had once been enough but had gradually stopped being so. My mother's furniture was good but tired. The wallpaper in the hallway was the same wallpaper that had been there since 1993. That Thanksgiving, over dessert, Diane told the table that she had just been named a top producer at her firm for the 3rd year running. This was announced with the specific modesty of someone who has rehearsed their own news in the car on the way over. My mother applauded. My father said, "That's wonderful, Diane." Diane looked at me across the table and said, "And what's new with you, Mira? Any big projects?" My mother said warmly that I had redesigned a beautiful house on East Jones Street. Diane nodded with the expression of someone who has been told about a child's finger painting and is searching for something charitable to say. I said, "It was a good project." I had, that month, signed the contract for the Congress Street developer. The ink was 3 days old. I said nothing. That evening, after the dishes were done and my father was asleep in his chair and my mother was in the kitchen with Aunt Rose, Diane found me in the hallway looking at a framed photograph my parents had taken on their 30th anniversary. The 2 of them in a restaurant, my mother in a blue dress, my father in a tie, both of them laughing at something I could not see. Diane stood beside me for a moment. Then she said, quietly, so that only I could hear, "You know Mom and Dad are never going to say this to your face, but they worry about you. The whole decorating thing. They think you're wasting your degree." I looked at the photograph. I said, "Thank you for telling me." She went back to the kitchen. I stood in the hallway for another minute, in the quiet that had become less like suppression and more like strategy, less like smallness and more like intent. Then I went and helped my mother with the leftovers. The 16 months that followed that Thanksgiving were the most productive of my professional life. By the end of year 2, Hartwell Creative Interiors had completed 9 projects, had brought Vanessa on full-time in February, and had brought on a project coordinator named Ben Lark in August. My revenue for that year was $281,000. I opened a commercial studio space in a converted carriage house on Liberty Street. I hired an accountant. I became a professional member of the American Society of Interior Designers, and I submitted my portfolio to Architectural Digest's open call for emerging studios in early spring of year 3. During the 6 months I was working on my parents' home, I was careful. I came during the day when Diane was unlikely to call. I kept my van, plain white, no markings, parked behind the house when unloading materials. My parents told the neighbors that a contractor friend was doing some renovation work as a gift, which was true. It was simply truer than it appeared. I sourced plaster ceiling medallions from an estate sale in Macon. I commissioned a woodworker named Earl Saunders to rebuild the staircase banister in white oak. I found wallpaper, a hand-painted botanical print in sage and ivory, from a small studio in Charleston that my mother had pointed to in a magazine 3 years earlier, tearing the page out without knowing why, just because it was beautiful. I installed it in the dining room and it transformed the space the way a piece of music transforms a room. I sourced every piece of furniture personally. The hall table from an antique dealer in Beaufort. The settee from an auction in Augusta. The dining chairs reupholstered in a textured linen the color of river clay, from a wholesale house I had a long-standing vendor relationship with. There were moments during those 6 months when I would be standing in my parents' dining room, the very room where Diane had set down her fork and said basically decorating, and I would be reviewing paint samples or pressing my hands against freshly hung wallpaper, and I would think about what it meant to do this work in this particular room, in this particular house, for these particular people. I did not feel angry. I want to be clear about that. What I felt was closer to purpose, a very clean, very quiet kind of purpose. I finished the redesign 11 days before the anniversary dinner. My parents walked through the completed house on a Thursday afternoon at 3 o'clock, and my mother stood in the doorway of the dining room for a long time without speaking. My father placed his hand on my shoulder. He said, "Mira." Just that. Just my name, the way you say a word when it means more than it sounds like. 3 weeks before the dinner, an email arrived in my inbox on a Friday morning in late August. The subject line read, "Feature confirmation. Hartwell Creative Interiors, February issue." It was from the editorial assistant at Architectural Digest. I sat in my car in the parking lot of a hardware store in Savannah and I read that email 4 times. Then I called David. He did not answer. I left a voicemail that was mostly silence, and then me saying, "It happened," and then more silence, and then me laughing in a way I had not laughed since before that Christmas dinner, when Diane sat down her fork and said basically decorating. I did not call my parents. Not yet. I did not call Diane. I sat in that parking lot for 9 minutes. Then I drove to the fabric supplier and finished my afternoon. If you are still watching this, I want you to drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever had someone in your life who spoke about you like you weren't in the room? Like you were a problem that had already been solved? A chapter that had already been closed? Because I think that feeling, that particular invisibility, is something so many of us carry for far longer than we should. And I want you to know that if you are in the middle of your own silent build right now, the quiet that you are living in is not weakness. It is infrastructure. Subscribe if this story is reaching you. We post every week, and every story is for the woman who kept building when no one was watching. On the evening of the anniversary dinner, I arrived at my parents' house at 4:30 in the afternoon to help set the table. The house looked exactly as I had left it, the botanical wallpaper in the dining room, the white oak banister, the hall table from Beaufort bearing my mother's silver candlesticks, which she had owned for 40 years and which now, in this new context, looked as though they had always been precisely the right choice. Diane and Kenneth arrived at 6:15 with Olivia, who was 17 now and more interested in her phone than in the family dynamics around her. I thought, privately, that this was wise. Diane walked through the front door and stopped. She stood in the hallway for 3 full seconds. She looked at the walls. She looked at the staircase. She looked at the hall table. She said, "You hired someone?" My mother said, "Come see the dining room." Diane walked through slowly. She touched the wallpaper with one finger, the way you touch something you cannot quite categorize. She said, "This is incredible. Who did this?" My father said, "Come have a drink first. We will talk over dinner." My mother smiled in the particular way she smiles when she knows something wonderful is about to happen and is restraining herself with great effort. Diane spent the first hour of dinner complimenting the house to Kenneth and to Olivia and to my mother, saying things like, "It looks like a magazine," and "I can't believe how different it feels." She did not ask me. She did not look at me when she said these things. In her mental architecture, the redesign and I occupied different categories and could not logically intersect. I ate my dinner. I talked with my father about his tomato garden. I talked with Olivia about the college applications she was starting. I watched the wallpaper in the candlelight and I thought about Earl Saunders, who had spent 4 days on that banister, and who had left me a voicemail when he finished it, saying, "I think that might be the best work I've ever done." At 8:40 in the evening, my mother excused herself to get the anniversary cake from the kitchen. My father went with her. Kenneth went to use the restroom. Olivia was texting. Diane and I were momentarily alone at the table. She refilled her wine glass. She looked around the dining room again. Then she said, "Mom told me they used a contractor friend for all this. Do you know who? I'd love to get a name for a project Kenneth is working on." I said, "I'll find out for you." She nodded. At 9:15, I excused myself to step into the kitchen to help my mother with the cake. I was there for perhaps 4 minutes. When I came back to the dining room, I set the cake plates on the sideboard and quietly took my seat at the far end of the table. My seat is at the end. Diane's back was partially to me. My phone buzzed. I looked at the screen. The group thread was called Family Dinner. Diane's message read, "The loser is gone, come over after. I have champagne." I read it once. I read it again. Then I looked up at the back of her head. I typed 2 sentences. "I'm sitting right behind you. I've been here the whole time." I hit send. In the half-second between my message transmitting and her phone receiving it, the dining room was quiet, just the sound of my mother cutting cake and my father asking Kenneth about a golf tournament. Then Diane's phone lit up on the table beside her plate. She read it. Her body went still the way a person goes still when their nervous system understands something before their mind does. I watched the muscles across her shoulders change. I watched her hand set the phone face down on the tablecloth. Then she turned. Our eyes met. Her face was the color of the plaster ceiling above her. I held her gaze. I did not smile. I did not make any expression she could have called triumphant or vindictive or even satisfied. I simply looked at her with the same calm attention I would give to a room I was about to redesign, observing, noting, deciding what needed to stay and what needed to go. My mother, who had seen none of this exchange, said warmly, "Diane, would you like to say something? You are the oldest." Diane opened her mouth. She closed it. My father said, "I'd like to say something actually, if that's all right." He stood up, which is a thing my father does only at moments of deliberate ceremony. He picked up his glass. "Your mother and I want to thank everyone for being here tonight. 40 years is a long time, and I have been thinking about what I want to say, and what I keep coming back to is that a life is only as good as what you build it from. The people. The choices. The work." He paused. He looked at me. "Speaking of which, we owe someone a proper introduction." My mother said, "We hired an interior designer to redo the house as a gift to ourselves for our anniversary. We have kept this secret for 6 months." She was smiling in a way that had become impossible to contain. "We want to tell you who she is." Diane was very still. My father said it was Mira. There was a silence at that table that I will remember for the rest of my life. Kenneth said, "Sorry, Mira." "As in your Mira?" My mother said, "Mira Callahan Weston, Hartwell Creative Interiors. She's been running her own interior design studio for 31 months. We've been sworn to secrecy and have barely survived it." She said that last part with a satisfaction that told me she'd been waiting a very long time to say it. Diane said nothing. I reached into my bag, which was on the chair behind me, and I took out 2 things. The printed email from Architectural Digest, and a copy of the Hartwell Creative Portfolio booklet that I had printed for client meetings. 40 pages, spiral-bound. Photographs of 9 completed projects. I passed the portfolio to my father. He opened it and turned it so the table could see the first spread, the Congress Street conversion, full-page photograph, the words Hartwell Creative Interiors in the lower corner. I said quietly, "I also wanted to share something. I received a confirmation 3 weeks ago. Hartwell Creative will be featured in the February issue of Architectural Digest. 8 pages. 3 projects." I set the email on the table. I built it in silence for 31 months. Olivia looked up from her phone. She said, "Aunt Mira, that's Architectural Digest." I said, "Yes." Kenneth looked at the portfolio. Then he looked at Diane. Then he looked at the portfolio again. My mother was crying quietly, the way she cries at graduations and at the end of good films, with her hand pressed flat against her sternum and her smile completely undisguised. My father sat back down. He said, "We are very proud of you, Mira. We should have said that louder, and far earlier." I looked at him. I said, "You're saying it now?" Diane still had not spoken. She was looking at the table in front of her, not at me, not at the portfolio, not at anything in particular. Her wine glass was full, her cake was untouched. I did not push. I did not look at her with any expression she could have read as victory. I had not done any of this to defeat her. I had done it because the work was real and it deserved to exist in the light. And the 40th anniversary of my parents' marriage was the right place and the right time to let it out of the silence where I had been keeping it safe. Kenneth said, "Mira, the wallpaper in here, the botanical print? Where did you source that? I have been looking for something for a project in Hilton Head for 6 months and I cannot find the right thing." I told him. I said I would send him the contact information. He said, "Can I get your card?" Diane picked up her wine glass. She took a long sip. Then she said very quietly, "How much does a feature in Architectural Digest mean for a business like yours?" I looked at her. I said, "I'll let you know after February." That was the only moment I allowed myself. That one sentence. That one small, clean exchange of information. The dinner continued. My mother cut more cake. My father kept the Hartwell portfolio beside his chair as though intending to sleep with it there. Olivia asked me 40 minutes of questions about interior design as a career, and I answered each of them carefully because she was 17 and curious, and that deserved full respect. Diane was quiet for the remainder of the evening. At 10:40, she said she was tired and began gathering her things. She put on her coat. She looked at me once, briefly, as she moved toward the door. She said, "I'll call you." I said okay. She left with Kenneth and Olivia. The door closed. My mother and I stood in the kitchen and she held me for a long time. She said, "I'm sorry we didn't lend you that money." I said, "I built it without it." She said, "I know. I think that might be why it turned out as beautiful as it did." Diane called me on a Monday morning at 10:20, 4 days after the anniversary dinner. I was in my studio on Liberty Street, reviewing fabric samples with Vanessa for a new client in Bluffton, when my phone lit up with her name. I excused myself and took the call in the small room at the back of the carriage house that serves as my office, where I keep the green notebooks, and my grandmother's silver thimble on the windowsill. She said, "I want to explain about the text." I said, "Okay." She said, "It wasn't meant the way it sounds. Sasha and I have a way of talking between us. It's just shorthand, it doesn't mean." I said, "Diane, I'm going to stop you there." She stopped. I said, "I know what it meant. You know what it meant. Explaining the shorthand doesn't change what the shorthand was shorthand for." I paused. "I'm not angry with you. I need you to understand that. I'm not calling you from a place of anger." She was quiet. I said, "What I want to tell you is that the last time you made a comment like that one, the one at Christmas, about my work not being real interior design, I had 2 full-time employees and was on track to clear nearly $300,000 that year. You didn't know that because I didn't tell you. I didn't tell you because I had learned over a long time that telling you gave you an opportunity to reduce what I was building before it was strong enough to withstand being reduced." She said, after a moment, "That's not fair." I said, "Which part of what I just told you isn't fair?" She said, "That you decided I was the villain and built a case against me instead of talking to me." I considered this. I said, "That might be true. But I want to ask you something honestly. If I had come to you, any of those times, after the loan, after the Christmas dinner, after any of it, and said, 'Diane, what you said hurt me and here is why,' what do you think you would have done?" She did not answer. I said, "I think you would have explained why I was wrong to be hurt. I think you would have told me I was being sensitive. I think you would have found a way to make the conversation about your intentions rather than my experience. And I think I would have left that conversation feeling worse than when I went in." She said, "You don't know that." I said, "I've known you for 34 years. There was a long silence. Then she said in a voice that was smaller than her usual voice, "I thought you were fine. I didn't think you needed anything from me." I said, "Diane, there is a difference between fine and invisible. You made me invisible. You made my work invisible. And then you were surprised when it turned out to be visible all along." She started crying then. Not loudly. Just the particular quietness of someone who has been holding something they owe themselves and can no longer hold it. I did not rush to smooth it over. I sat with it. Some reckonings need to be sat with. That is where the real change actually happens. I said, I don't need an apology. What I need is for things to be different going forward. That is the whole ask. She said, okay. I said, okay. We talked for another 12 minutes about nothing important. Then I went back to the fabric samples. In the weeks after the dinner, several things happened. Kenneth emailed me about the Hilton Head project. We spoke for an hour, and by the end of that call, I had a contract for a 6-room residential commission, worth $86,000. He sent me a referral 2 months later for another developer in Charleston. I thought of that as its own kind of acknowledgement. My mother framed a photograph of the completed dining room, the botanical wallpaper, the river clay chairs, the candlelight, and hung it in the kitchen, directly across from the window that looks out over the vegetable garden my father tends every morning. The Architectural Digest feature ran in February. The profile described Hartwell Creative Interiors as a Savannah-based studio whose work occupies the precise intersection of historical reverence and contemporary restraint. I read that sentence in my car in the parking lot of the coffee shop where I had gone to buy David a celebration latte, and I called him and read it to him out loud. He said, I always knew. I said, I know you did. Diane texted me on the day the magazine came out. The message said, I bought 3 copies. Congratulations, Mira, I mean it. I believed her. Not because she had instantly earned my easy trust back. Trust is rebuilt in small, consistent actions over time, not in a single generous gesture. But because I know my sister, and I know when she means something and when she is performing meaning, and that text was real. I replied, thank you. That means something. It did. I want to talk about what I learned from all of this, because that is the part that matters most. I did not build my business in secret because I was clever or because I had a plan to humiliate my sister at a dinner table. I built it in secret because the alternative, building it in the open, where it could be questioned and diminished and picked apart before it was strong enough to withstand any of that, felt like a risk I was not willing to take with something I cared about this much. What I learned is that there is a version of silence that is avoidance, and there is a version of silence that is protection. Avoidant silence gets smaller over time. It closes around you. Protection silence is different. It is active. It is the silence of someone who knows exactly what they are doing and has chosen not to announce it because the announcement would cost more than the work is currently worth. The silence I chose was the second kind. I knew what I was building. I knew why I was building it. And I knew, somewhere in the long quiet of those 31 months, that the work would eventually speak in rooms where my voice alone would have been dismissed. What I want to say to you, if you are in your own silent build right now, if there is someone in your life who has told you, in words or in tone or in the particular way they pick up their fork at a holiday dinner, that you are not quite enough, is this: keep building. Not to prove something to them. That is too small a reason and will run out of fuel. Build because the work itself is worth building. Build because your grandmother's name deserves to be on something. Build because the room where they dismissed you is the same room where the truth will eventually have to exist, and when it does, you will not need to raise your voice. You will just need to be sitting there. The loudest comebacks are built in silence. I should know. I built mine in a green spiral notebook at a kitchen table at 7 in the morning for 2.5 years, while someone who had already decided my outcome was telling me it wasn't real. The magazine feature is hanging on the wall of my studio on Liberty Street, right next to my grandmother's silver thimble. Right where they both belong. If you are watching this and there is a person in your life who treats your work like a footnote, what is the one thing you have been building in silence that they don't know about yet? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And to everyone who has been watching this channel, who shows up every week for these stories, I want to say something that comes from somewhere genuine and not from a script. You are the reason we keep telling these. Every comment you leave reminding us that you saw yourself in a story. Every subscriber who brings a friend to this channel. Every person who shares a video with someone they know who needs to hear it. You are building something too. You are building a space where quiet women are finally loud. We are grateful for you in ways that a number on a screen cannot hold. Follow us for more stories. These women are just getting started, and honestly, so are we.